Am I like a month late in reviewing this? Yes. Do I care? No. Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new-ish Olivia Rodrigo record, Guts. If you don't know who Olivia Rodrigo is by this point, I'm just gonna assume you've been living in another galaxy for the past couple of years. I mean, I would say another planet, but I'm 99.9% sure that microbacteria on Mars have her driver's license, and good for you at this point, so I don't know, I can't even say it's within the Milky Way. I'm just gonna assume you've been a few light years away by this point. I don't think it's controversial to say that Sour was the definitive album of 2021 as far as popularity goes, and it's also an album that I found to have really grown on me since its initial release. I was somewhat negative in the way that I perceived it when it first dropped, and honestly, I'm glad that I didn't have this channel when it first came out, because I think my review of it at the time would not be at all reflective of how I feel about it now. It's far from a perfect album. In fact, I think it's deeply flawed in a lot of ways, but it's still a highly recommendable album, and as far as the major blockbuster releases that we get every year go, it's probably one of the better pop releases of the past couple of years. No matter how massive Sour was as an album goes, it always felt like the follow up to that record was going to be a bigger deal in the end, and that follow up ended up being Guts. I mean, sure, it was never going to match her debut in the same way commercially, but at the same time, it almost felt like there was a bigger axe to potentially fall here. I mean, would Olivia Rodrigo continue to stay successful within the mainstream eye and become a sort of continuous icon in popular music, or would she kind of go the Alanis Morissette route and have a very angsty, powerful debut album that just really strikes a chord with the masses before completely falling off and never really being heard from again? It was a question that was burning the second that this album even got rumored. I mean, simply put, it was the question of would she fall off after her first LP, or would she just step up to bat again, put out another smash hit record, and, well, like I said, it's been roughly a month since this album came out as I review this, which is only like 3.5 weeks late, no big deal. And as those days have proven, it's the latter. She has continued to be successful. Guts was a big deal when it came out. It was everywhere. It's still everywhere as of recording this. And you know what? Rightfully so. Because honestly, this is an improvement over Sour. In fact, I would go as far to say that Guts improves a lot of the best qualities of Sour and really just taking them up tenfold while really getting rid of, or at the very least to an extent fixing, a lot of the more major flaws that were found on her debut. Some of Sour's best moments came from its angsty pop rock tracks, like Brutal, as well as the aforementioned Good For You, but those songs were few and far between on that record, really only making up maybe 10 to 15% of the overall track list. They were highlights, they just weren't representative of the record as a whole. And because of that, the high quality nature of all of those more up-tempo tracks, the magnification that those sounds have on Guts is a really nice thing to see, and it's a major positive aspect of this record in comparison to its predecessor. Whether you're discussing the album opener All American Bitch or the 90s alt rock power pop influenced Ballad of a Homeschool Girl, there's a lot of angsty, punkish kind of energy going on here that I can really get behind personally. And the influence that Olivia takes from a lot of classic alt rock bands like The Breeders, who she's touring with coincidentally, is really evident here, but not in a way that feels like it's a sort of ripoff or anything like that. More just like a very energetic homage to a lot of older sounds that a lot of old school indie rock fans will be very much familiarized with, presented in a, pretty fresh light as a whole. More importantly, though, the increase in number of these more rock-oriented songs allows all of the ballad-based tracks to stand out way more than they ever managed to do on Sour. I really do think that Sour is a strong album, but that being said, as I stated, it's a flawed record, and a lot of its track list does tend to bleed together a little bit, as it heavily leans into a lot of these bedroom pop singer-slash-songwriter tendencies that ultimately are good and well executed, but and as far as an album experience goes, it just doesn't really result in the most exciting thing in the world in terms of listening to it from front to back. That's not to say that every single song that was more singer-songwriter oriented on Sour was bad, but at the same time, they definitely didn't stand out as much as they do here, where you have tracks like The Grudge and Lacey that wouldn't have stood out on that aforementioned album, but here, because of the more even mixture of styles, they stand out and really manage to showcase how strong of a performer Olivia is in a variety of ways, but that's something I'll touch on in a little bit. These slower songs feel like they have more creative identity on this record. They feel a little bit more unique. They just feel a bit more essential in general as far as how much they contribute to the overall listening experience. It's nice to see these songs, which were, again, good on Sour, being evolved here, not only musically, but just in terms of how important they feel to actually hear in the context of a record. I would also say, in regards to the slower, more ballad-like songs, that the production on them does help them a lot, whereas Sour felt, again, more like a bedroom pop kind of style. This record's slower tracks have this very lush, grand feel to them, as if they're kind of taking place in this empty concert hall or something along those lines. And while they could have ended up being kind of corny or maybe even just a bit cliche because of that, I think ultimately the honesty in Olivia's vocal work, in her performance work, and in her lyrical work, it all ultimately results in a performance that feels genuine, even if there are a ton of singer-songwriter types out there trying to do piano ballads in empty concert halls. It's a bit of an overdone thing at this point, but you know, here it works. Plus, she isn't the most versatile vocalist in the world, but at the same time, during choruses, Rodrigo's vocals can feel downright explosive, and she can really soar in some of the most passionate moments of this record. And during verses, where everything's are just a bit more subtle and taken aback, it really does feel like she can deliver a nicely nuanced set of lyrics, both in terms of actual writing and in terms of vocal delivery. I think ultimately this is a pretty impressive outing for her from that perspective as well. In all honesty, it really does feel like Guts is a major improvement lyrically from Olivia from Sour. I mean, sure, Sour was a record with a lot of genuine lyrics, a lot of personal lyrics, but very rarely were there any moments where it felt like she was going so introspective that she was having some sort of moment of amazing depth, this sort of one-on-one convo with the listener. Those moments never really appeared on Sour, even though they very obviously were trying to exist within that record, but here, it feels like there's a lot more depth. The songwriting, while not necessarily shallow on the predecessor album, it definitely feels shallow by comparison here. Not to say it's bad on Sour, but Guts definitely blows it out the water in that regard. That being said, I do agree with a lot of people who state that some of the appeal of Sour in the first place was a lot of the simplicity and even the somewhat immaturity of a lot of the lyrics on that record, so it was important for Guts to continue the charm of the first album from Olivia while sort of maintaining its own identity, seeing her grow artistically and in terms of writing. And, you know, a nice balance is struck between immaturity and maturity, as oxymoronic as that sounds. Songs like Love is Embarrassing, as well as the musically shockingly progressive Vampire, are really walking this fine line between being written by a teenage girl and being written by a grizzled veteran of tragic, unfortunate love. And as odd of a dynamic as that sounds, it just kind of works. It also kind of feels like Olivia really gained a sense of self-awareness between album cycles here. I mean, you have tracks like All American Bitch, for example, which, as I mentioned before, opens up the record extremely well, and you have a lot of lyrics there that see her recognizing her own lack of perfection and really going against a lot of the societal norms, kind of celebrating herself for who she is above all else, while still having to recognize a lot of these flaws within herself as a person. It's a surprisingly powerful song. All American Bitch is especially layered with so many verses of pure irony and, again, rejecting social norms and beauty standards that it's kind of impressive just in a writing sense alone. The follow-up track, Bad Idea Right, which is arguably the biggest highlight on the entirety of the record, sees her narrate the story of her hooking up with her ex, realizing the terrible choices that she's making, and still just acknowledging them, but going through with them anyway for the sake of potentially rekindling what romance they have left between them. And with that and the sort of campy nature of the topic at hand, it makes for something that's not only surprisingly self-aware, but a bit shockingly genuine. I mean, there are so many songs songs out there being written about reconnecting with old flames, that having a song where the narrator does that but also realizes that it's a stupid idea is kind of refreshing. I think that if anything, it's songs like these that really prove how much Olivia Rodrigo has grown as a songwriter over the course of the past couple of years. I mean, a modern day Joni Mitchell she is not, but at the same time, she is nonetheless managing to continue to find her own self-defined niche within the realm of popular singer-songwriter types, and she's doing it really well. That being said, while I do think this is still a step up from Sour, Guts is a flawed album nonetheless. While the balance of types of songs on Guts is well maintained, I can't really say the same exact thing for the pacing of the record. I mean, for example, having a, again, heavily ballad-driven song like Logical right next to the experimental, semi-rap rock tendencies of Get Him Back, unsurprisingly, it doesn't make sense. And that's not to say that these are bad songs, they're still good tracks individually, and if they were placed elsewhere on the track list, I think that they would go over a lot better in terms of them inside of the listening experience. I do feel like Logical really demonstrates Rodrigo's ability as a songwriter. Get 'Em Back has a lot of great vocal work from Olivia, but at the same time, them being smashed next to each other on the track list, them just being right next to each other, even though they have nothing to even remotely connect them in any way, tonally or aesthetically, it's awkward to listen to, going from very powerful, emotionally driven piano balladry to not that. It's a bit of a whiplash. There's also a major lack of consistency in Dan Nigro's production work. I mean, he's not a bad producer by any means, it's just that he doesn't really find a singular place to put Olivia's music in terms of sound quality and in terms of atmosphere, and again, it's not necessarily that it makes for a bad album, it's that it just makes for a bit of an awkward flow. As I said earlier, a lot of the more stripped down songs have this grand atmospheric feeling to them, and that works out really well for those particular tracks. But the more upbeat, rock-oriented numbers tend to be a lot more grounded, a lot more tied to the studio, if you will, way more polished naturally. And again, it works well for those songs, but at the same time, having those kinds of songs, those two completely separate identities artistically next to each other constantly at all times with no sort of bridge going between them or anything like that, it just makes for a bit of a jumpy, odd listening experience. I mean, these different types of tracks are just sort of jumbled up and strewn about the record at random, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it also does mean that I kind of wish that the production here just leaned in one direction or the other, and not both simultaneously. Again, it's not so bad that it makes for a bad album or anything, it's just odd to hear. I know it's been almost a month since this album released, and I can pretty confidently say that Guts was from the start going to be a make or break moment for Olivia Rodrigo, and it's a make moment. Definitely not a break moment. She's still here, she's still a massive name in pop music, still arguably the biggest pop star on the planet, not named Taylor, so that's a pretty big deal overall, I would say. My point is that Olivia Rodrigo is still relevant, she has not fallen off in any way, and she's still selling out arenas because she wants to and she's able to. Guts may not be a masterpiece by any means, but it's a demonstration of artistic evolution for Olivia Rodrigo, as well as a great example of what she is capable of in her best moments. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.